Well, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with SP History. And today we are beginning a new mini-series, and the topic is Ukraine. I'm pausing from my JFK material for just a brief interlude here because this is a very relevant topic. This is something I would do with my history classes from time to time. We'd be studying uh, the New Deal or, you know, Reconstruction after the Civil War or whatever, and something significant would be happening that I thought warranted a timeout to educate the kids on what was really happening versus what they were reading in the news or hearing or seeing, whichever. And there's been so much misinformation about Ukraine, so much disinformation, so much ignorance, actually. And I feel like this is a very, very relevant topic, and it really matters today because we've been on a 30-year path here in America, and it's had very serious repercussions around the world. And so going forward, if we're going to get off that path, that dangerous path, it might behoove us to know the backstory. It might help us if we understood exactly how things have been going that have brought us to this place. So I've labeled this three-part miniseries, Ukraine, Putin's Cuban Missile Crisis. And of course, we've talked a lot, if you've been following me with the JFK series, about the Cuban Missile Crisis and how it had such wide-ranging ramifications, not just for the United States, but for the world. But one of the things that it brought home to Americans for the first time was just how vulnerable we were in a nuclear age to attack, especially from a base 90 miles off the shore of Florida, and how all of those missiles could reach all of our major US cities. And, you know, we hadn't ever encountered that before. We had, for many years, gotten safe, maybe lulled into a false sense of security, perhaps, because we're surrounded by, on two sides, ocean. And in our hemisphere to the north and south of us, countries that are largely supportive or allies of ours, not going to be a problem for us. And so we've had this sense of security that other countries around the world don't have. They don't enjoy that same sense of security. And so I think it's important uh, to be able to put yourself in the other person's shoes if you're going to accurately understand what is going on. We didn't like it when Khrushchev put missiles in Cuba and aimed them at us, and it was a red line. It was a very, very bold red line. Even JFK was not willing to allow the Soviets to cross. And so it might just be that there are red lines that other countries have as well. And we would be well served to understand what those red lines are. So let's talk about this. Um, First of all, if you're interested in this topic, and I think you should be, there's just a multitude of sources out there, but you've got to be careful because some of these sources are sort of regime mouthpieces that have been out there fronting for this 30-year foreign policy that we've had. And they just more of the same. And they're always, you can kind of tell they're going to set us up to be the good guys and the Russians to be the bad guys. If you're hearing that in anything that's coming, uh, any information that you're using as a source, you're not getting a balanced view of things. Uh, a more nuanced view is that we both bear responsibility and for where we find ourselves today. At the very minimum, it might even be that we bear more of the responsibility. If you're just getting your information from sources that say United States good guys, Russians bad guys, Well, that's just a continuation of the Cold War mindset since 19 what 45, and we've always had the Russians as a boogeyman, and we continue to use the Russians as a boogeyman. So I have chosen as some of my source materials for the information I'm going to share in the next 3 episodes, and these guys are widely. Uh, you can find them anywhere, and they're talking about these topics. RFK Jr. ran for president, and so he's got all kinds of YouTube. He's written about it. He's given speeches on it. He's done a lot of podcasts on this. So RFK Jr. is one of my sources. Another one is Jeffrey Sachs, who has been sounding the alarm, probably the loudest. He's kind of been the John the Baptist or the canary in the coal mine, uh, warning of the direction that we were heading for 30 years. And people have laughed him off. But now all of a sudden, people are listening to him. So these are 2 sources that you might check out. 2 others are John Mearsheimer and Victor Davis Hanson. And Victor Davis Hanson gives us the wide view. He's a historian, teaches at Stanford, Hillsdale College, and other places. You see him on Fox News a lot, but he does a lot of podcasts. I think he has his own podcast as well. But he's a classical historian, and he understands history going back to the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans. So he puts it in a very big, large worldview perspective. John Mearsheimer as well. So I've used 2 more current sources and 2 more sources that use a wide angle view of history, world history, to look at it in 2 different ways. One from a narrow perspective, what's happening in the last 30 years, and then 2 from a more wide world view going back hundreds of years to give us a little bit of perspective. So anyway, I just wanted to list some of these sources so you could kind of search this out for yourself, confirm, kind of research it yourself if you're interested. All right. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about the backstory and how it brought us to this point. We're going to start in 1990. Of course, if you want to go back, Russia was our ally during World War II. The war ends in 45, and almost immediately we end up in this Cold War standoff between us and the Soviets. That goes until 89, 90-ish. And I grew up during that era, and I was taught by all of my teachers that the Russians were basically trigger happy Neanderthals, and the only reason we had a thermonuclear war to this point is because the Americans have kept the Russians at bay. We were the good guys on the white horse, the white knight, and the knight on the white horse. They were always the bad guys. It was us versus them. You have a protagonist, you have an antagonist, and that's the story that we're all told. When the Cold War ended, we didn't have that story anymore, and we had to sort of manufacture one. So this is February 9th, 1990. The United States president, who you can see here, is meeting with the Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. Tony Blair was there as well from Great Britain. And Gorbachev was trying to manage the decline of the Soviet Union. He's trying to figure out, at this point in time, the satellites are rebelling. Everywhere he looks, there's a rebellion. He's trying to keep this all together. They're broke. The Soviet Union is broke. We've spent them into oblivion. They're on the verge of bankruptcy. They can't keep up in the arms race. Their economy's in shambles. People don't have any food to eat. Inflation. I mean, it's just a mess. It's a mess. And so he's trying to manage this. And he discusses this issue with these 2 world leaders, George H.W. Bush and Tony Blair. And he says, we're coming apart at the seams. And he's trying to get some assurances. Of course, he doesn't really have a leg to stand on. He's not bargaining from a position of strength, but he is trying to get some assurances that if I allow the Soviet Union to break up and I pull out 450,000 Soviet troops from East Germany, that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward beyond Germany itself after it was reunified. So he's trying to get a promise from the United States primarily, and of course the United States basically is NATO, as we're finding out today. You take the United States out of NATO, even in 2025, NATO is nothing. It's nothing. It's absolutely nothing. Europe is a paper tiger. It's dependent on the United States protection, and they call it NATO. It's face saving, but basically it's the United States. You take the United States out of NATO, NATO does not exist. If tomorrow Donald Trump pulled the United States out of NATO, NATO would fall apart like a house of cards. And I think Putin knows that. Anyway, so he's really negotiating with the US president at this point. And through our US Secretary of State James Baker, George H.W. Bush makes a promise in 1990 to Mikhail Gorbachev that after Germany, East Germany and West Germany are reunified and accepted into NATO, no, NATO would not move 1 inch eastward after German reunification. And that was to ease Mikhail Gorbachev's fears that if he allowed this, that they created this buffer zone around Russia for a purpose. They've been invaded so many times. And so these Baltic states that were part of the Soviet Union were primarily as a buffer zone against primarily German aggression. And so he's going to, if he's going to allow the Soviet Union to break apart, he's going to lose that buffer zone. So he's trying to get a promise from the West, from the United States, from NATO, that there will be no more incursions into that buffer zone area where those Baltic states are. And NATO will stop once Germany is reunified. Obviously, Germany will be in NATO, but no other countries further east on the Russian border will be accepted or even invited into NATO. This was a promise by the US president through whom James Baker made this promise. Those are his exact words to Mikhail Gorbachev, but those are the words of his president. He is bringing a message to Mikhail Gorbachev that this is once he brought this up at this meeting, and they went back and talked about it. George H.W. Bush agreed, sent James Baker back to talk to Mikhail Gorbachev, and these are the words that he gave, the promise that he gave him. The German foreign minister, Hans Dietrich Genscher, followed up, promising essentially the same thing. So Mikhail Gorbachev proceeds along the path at that point to breaking apart the Soviet Union based on a promise that the United States made to him, which essentially means a promise that NATO made to him. 7 years later, we get this this guy named Brzezinski, and you may be familiar with his daughter. She's on MSNBC every morning, Mika Brzezinski. But anyway, he was the former national security advisor of the United States under President Jimmy Carter, and he's one of the original neocons. You hear that phrase thrown around a lot. A neocon is short for neoconservative, and these are the folks that believe in continual wars. This wasn't necessarily during the Cold War because though it was cold, we had an enemy. We always had an enemy. It was the Soviet Union. And we fought several proxy wars during that 45, 46-year period in Korea and Vietnam. We had the issues in Cuba constantly, Afghanistan. We had these proxy wars, but it was always because it was always understood that the United States enemy in this bipolar world was the Soviet Union. Well, when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union broke apart, was no longer a threat. We now are living in what people like Brzezinski consider to be a unipolar world, which means we're the only superpower. And in order to continue that, we're going to have to manufacture enemies, manufacture wars to keep the United States citizens, the American people, on this war footing in order to achieve this unipolar destiny that folks like Brzezinski believe the United States is destined to. It's kind of like manifest destiny. We are chosen by God to claim all the land from sea to shining sea. So if that means we have to get the Indians out of the way, so be it. If it means we have to take land from the Mexicans, so be it. However, it happens, it's because God has ordained this. And guys like Brzezinski, these neocons, they're true believers. They really believe that the United States is the sole superpower after the Soviet Union fell apart. And so they began proposing this very bad idea, which was to move NATO into the 15 nations that border Russia. Now, this is, we just learned that we promised 7 years earlier that we'd never do this. But guys like Brzezinski don't care about promises that George H.W. Bush might have made, or James Baker might have made, or the foreign minister from Germany might have made, or NATO might have made. That doesn't matter. This is all in an effort to create a unipolar world whereby the United States is the sole superpower and everybody else is subservient. And to keep Russia from ever reconstituting itself or ever coming back, we needed to move NATO. Technically, if you think about it, NATO only existed to prevent Soviet expansion during the time of the Cold War. Well, the Cold War is over. The Soviet Union no longer exists. So technically, NATO really has no purpose. But guys like Brzezinski and these neocons see a purpose in NATO, and that is world domination now. And the president in 97 was Bill Clinton. And when Brzezinski proposes this project of moving NATO closer and closer to Russia's border, expanding NATO, Bill Clinton signed on to this project. And for the next 30 years, excuse me, that's what we've been doing. We've been expanding and expanding and expanding NATO. We took this idea that Brzezinski had, these neocons, and Bill Clinton signed on to the project, started it, and every subsequent president, with the exception of Trump, has signed on to it and agreed. And here's a map just to kind of show you what this expansion has looked like. The original NATO, and the dark black you see are the original Cold War NATO members. Okay, I shouldn't say the dark black. It's the gray. So it's the darker gray. So you can see Italy's boot there, and you've got Spain and Germany after it's reunified, and France and Great Britain and Denmark up there next to Sweden, and across the ocean, United States and Canada, et cetera, et cetera. All right. The project sort of begins in 97. And in 2004, the lighter gray, you can see I've put red dots in these countries. You can see the expansion that takes place in 2004. It's 3 countries there. And of course, Poland is right on Russia's border. And then by 2009, you see more countries joining NATO. And then between 2017 and 20, 3 years, the lighter gray, you see more countries joining NATO. And then you see the red line, which is Ukraine. NATO affirmed in 2008 that these countries will become members. And of course, we're going to find out real quick that Russia considers Ukraine to be that red line. And then you even have some countries dark red, like Sweden and Finland, countries that have applied for NATO membership and are awaiting ratification. So you start adding up all these dots, and you see there's, after making a promise that we would not expand NATO 1 inch to the east after Germany, we've broken our promise not once, not twice, not 3 times, tens of times. Count up the dots. And the Russians didn't make a move to respond to this until we crossed the red line, and the red line for them was Ukraine and Georgia, which are both the countries in red, and they both have red dots in them. And these are the countries that in 2008, the United States and NATO said they're someday going to become members. And boy, that rattled the Russians' cage a little bit. So you start counting up these dots. You got 1, 2, Sweden and Finland. You got the 3 up there. So that's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. There's about 18, 19 countries. So that's about 18, 19 times that we've broken our promise to the Russians. And this is this is intentional. As I mentioned earlier, this is based on the project that Brzezinski came up with. He wrote 2 books about it, and Bill Clinton signed on to it. And we're going to expand NATO forever, anywhere. And we're just going to keep moving east. And it didn't matter who the president was. If you go back to the days of Clinton, and then you look at the presidents subsequent to Clinton, each one played his part. It was almost as if they were informed upon taking office, quote, NATO is moving eastward, and you are now part of that process. I don't care what you said in your campaign. That's, neither here nor there. That got you elected. But here's how things are done. And here is the project that we're involved in. And your job is to continue this process. This is one of the reasons why Trump became such a problem to the deep state, because, if you remember back in 2016, he started calling this out. And there was a fear that he was going to weaken NATO. He was saying NATO was involved in these never-ending wars, and he was upset that other countries weren't paying their fair share. In other words, he's calling out the fact that the United States is doing most of the work of NATO, and all these other countries are benefiting under the umbrella of U.S. protection and doing it for no cost. And he's tired of all these forever wars. So he's the first president. I remember when he was standing on that debate stage and Jeb Bush was arguing. Jeb Bush was the brother of George W. Bush and the son of George H.W. Bush, was largely, these guys are largely responsible, not completely responsible, but they're largely responsible for this NATO expansion. They're largely responsible for these forever wars. They're largely responsible for these European countries getting off scot-free, benefiting from U.S. protection. In other words, he's campaigning against them. And everybody who's standing on that stage with him in the 2016 primary, Republican, he was the sort of the outlier. I remember he was the one who was criticizing the Iraq war. He was the one criticizing the Afghanistan war. He was the one criticizing all these forever wars. And everybody else on stage was saying, basically that was like a Republican orthodoxy. That was something that the Republican Party, and it wasn't just Republicans, Democrats as well. But he's in the primary going against his own party. Everybody understands when whoever gets to the general election is going to be going against the Democrats, and you're going to be going against the opposite party. So you're going to have differing views for sure in the general election. But what was unique to Trump was he had differing views with respect to national security within his own party. So he becomes a real lightning rod going back to 2016, because he's the one prospective U.S. president, if you go back to 60, who wasn't going to go along with this project, this program. And they knew it. So even this is one of the reasons why you had these never Trumpers. A lot of them were Republicans, and they disagreed with him fundamentally on this main issue. They cloaked it under morals and all these other issues, but it was really about national security. Now, why was the United States so interested in NATO expansion? Beyond the fact, besides the fact that it would create this unipolar world with the United States as top dog, it also conforms everybody, all these NATO countries who come into NATO, all these countries that are accepted, these are invited into NATO, ratified into NATO, whatever. it conforms every one of these countries' weapons purchases to NATO specifications. We've already established that NATO is essentially the United States. So that means that they are now purchasing weapons from U.S. military contractors to get up to speed, to uh, to meet the criteria that NATO has for their military. This means, any kind of NATO expansion is going to mean big money for the U.S. military industrial congressional complex. They're going to be buying our weapons. And then, of course, you use those weapons in these constant wars, which means you got to replenish the weapons that you used in these wars. And then when that war is over, you feed it right into another war. And it just keeps this ball rolling downhill, and it's feeding this beast. And this beast is this military industrial congressional complex the United States has, because these NATO countries are buying our weapons. So it's not just, this is one of the things I've learned in my JFK research. Dwight Eisenhower warned of the the military industrial congressional complex. His speechwriters took the word congressional out of it to not offend Congress members, but that's really how it was originally written. And it requires all three: the military, who uses the weapons and orders the weapons, the industrial, which makes the weapons, and the congressional, which outlays the money to buy the weapons. So you got to have all three. So this military industrial congressional complex that Eisenhower warned about, JFK ran into, and started bucking up, fighting back against it. And the big issue at first was Cuba, and then it became Vietnam. And these wars that the national security apparatus, the deep state around him wanted. They wanted a war in Cuba, which is why Bay of Pigs happened. They wanted a war in Cuba, which is why Cuban Missile Crisis happened. When they got neither, they started pushing for the war in Vietnam, which they'd been laying the groundwork for years. And when it was pretty apparent that he wasn't going to give them that war, they killed him. All right. That's how. Now that was just U.S. Weapons. That was just the United States buying weapons from these big industries and going over and fighting these wars. We're not even talking about NATO, really. We're talking about the United States. Now add in all these countries that are a part of NATO, and then add in all the ones that get expanded from 1997 onward, 15, 18, whatever countries. And that's a lot of money flowing to the United States weapons manufacturers to make all these weapons, not just for the U.S. military, but now for our NATO allies. That is, money makes the world go around. It is, when you get back to the root cause of almost all of these wars, assassinations, crimes, whatever, it's almost always money. In fact, it always is money. And so this is why the United States was so keen on NATO expansion. It was big money for a lot of big, important people and industries back here in America. And if you were the president that agreed and went along with this NATO expansion, you benefited. And all these weapons manufacturers, the military benefit, these congressional members got kickbacks, they're signing off, they're voting yes on all these appropriations. It's a big money spigot, is what it is. NATO has become a big money spigot. And it's interesting. There were some people who said this is a mistake. For example, and these are what we call the realists. These are the people who say, realistically speaking, this cannot happen. This cannot proceed. If it does, it's going to lead to a war. The neocons are the ones who want the war, so they don't care if it leads to war. That suits their purposes. George Kennan was one of these realists. He was the architect of the original containment policy during the Cold War. If you remember the containment, that was just to keep the Soviets in their box, prevent them from expanding westward, and so we would use a variety of means, whether it was diplomacy or economic sanctions, sometimes military, whatever, support to other countries, aid to other countries. We had a lot of tools in our tool chest to try to keep the Soviets contained during the Cold War and prevent them from expanding. he was the architect of the containment policy, which worked reasonably well during that 46-year period. When he realized what the neocons were up to, he said, quote, Russia just lost the Cold War. This was after 90. He says the U.S. should be giving them a Marshall Plan and integrating them into civilized Western society. If you do this, talk about NATO expansion, you will make them an enemy. They've been our enemy for 45 years. Now they're not. This is our moment to make peace with these people and prevent a war. He says, don't treat them like they're still the enemy. They're not the enemy anymore. It will force a violent military response from Russia. NATO expansion will force a violent military response from Russia. This is George Kennan, and he's saying this. There's the article there. You can see it looks like a Time magazine article. And William Perry, who was President Clinton's Secretary of Defense, actually threatened to resign if the United States proceeded with such he called it a reckless plan. He threatened to quit. Nevertheless, in spite of George Kennan and William Perry, and there were others, but those are the two pretty prominent ones, in 1997, the first wave of NATO expansion took place, and it was in Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Poland. And you can see here, now Russia is the big gray monolithic area there on the right. And Ukraine is in yellow there, but the three blue, dark, kind of royal blue colorings there, that's Hungary, the Czechs, and the Poles. So that's 1999. So despite what George Kennan predicted, despite what William Perry predicted, we're going ahead. It's full steam ahead. In 2002, something else happened that the Russians noticed. Okay, they've already noticed that we've broken our promise. Other presidents have broken promises before. This isn't unique. This isn't unusual. This is the first time. We've even talked about Kennedy. Remember, Kennedy broke a promise after Bay of Pigs and said he wouldn't meddle in the affairs of Cuba anymore. Not only did he meddle, he doubled down, changed the name of Operation 40 to Operation Mongoose, and that forced Khrushchev to put missiles in Cuba to prevent a second invasion. And so here you see cause and effect. Well, in a previous occurrence where an American president lied. So the Russians are used to us lying. In 90, we promised we would not move NATO 1 inch eastward. And here in 99, we not only move it 1 inch eastward, we incorporate 3 countries that sit near the Russian border. One of them is right on the Russian border, into NATO. So we broke our promise. In 2002, we broke another promise. We had signed 2 anti-ballistic missile treaties with the Soviets. This was a core strategy to prevent a nuclear war between us and the Soviets during the Cold War. They had established a level of deterrence for over 30 years because what these anti-ballistic missile treaties, ABM treaties, did was they limited the first strike offensive capabilities of both sides. It didn't really deal with the defensive capabilities, but offensive. In other words, first strike capabilities. And if both sides abided by these 2 treaties, it pretty much rendered both of us incapable of launching a first strike against the other. And it put us in a position of, basically equal footing. And it provided deterrence. Well, in 2002, the United States unilaterally, this is George W. Bush, announced that we were walking out of both of these treaties and we were going to begin placing Aegis ballistic, these are offensive missiles, into Romania and Poland. Now remember, Poland has just become a NATO member. Romania is in Eastern Europe, one of the Baltic states. And by doing so now, the U.S. is destabilizing all of Europe. We have done 2 things now. We broke our promise and we expanded NATO eastward. And now because they are part of they're under the umbrella of NATO, we see an opportunity to put missiles in the Soviet or in Russia's hemisphere aimed at Russian targets in these new NATO countries. In other words, we're putting our offensive missiles on Russia's border and aiming them at Russian targets because we can. Knowing that they can't reciprocate, they don't have any territory in our hemisphere that will allow them to put offensive missiles and aim them at our targets. So it gives us this huge, it destroys deterrence, right? It breaks a promise, which breaks faith with the Russian people and the Russian leaders, and it destabilizes all of Europe because it's a very, very aggressive tactic. It's a very offensive, aggressive tactic, and boy, the Russians were, this really spooked them. And then right on the heels of that was 2002, 2004, we have a second wave of NATO expansion. Bulgaria, Estonia, these are all these Baltic states that used to be the buffer zone around Russia. Now they're ours. We've swallowed them up into NATO, and we're putting missiles, saying we're going to put missiles because we're out of the ABM treaty now. We are free and clear to go put Aegis missiles in these countries as well and aim them. I mean, we'll basically have the entire Russian country covered with our missiles, and the entire country is a target, essentially. So here you see the list of nations: Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovenia, Slovakia. This is 2004. And if you look at the map, there's the dots again to show these 7 countries. So if you add these 7 to the first 3, now you have 10 countries. We promised, remember, in 1990, it was our promise to Mikhail Gorbachev, if you break apart the Soviet Union, you don't have to worry about us. NATO will not move 1 inch eastward. Since that promise in 1990, 2004, 14 years later, we've had H.W. Bush president, we've had 8 years of Clinton, and now we're in the middle of George W. Bush. So we've had 2 Bushes and a Clinton, and we've broken that promise 10 times. And we've also unilaterally broken the promise about the ABM treaties, and now that clears the way for us to put offensive missiles on the border of Russia aimed at Russian targets. Is anybody starting to see a problem here? Nobody hears about this. When we talk about Ukraine today, oh, yeah, it's just about Putin and how he invaded Ukraine, these poor Ukrainians, right? Now, the backstory is very important here. In 2007, so this is 3 years after the expansion into 10 countries and the violation of the ABM treaties, at the Munich Security Conference, Vladimir Putin told the world, okay, it's not like it was a big secret, but he told the world at this conference that Ukraine was a red line. And he warned the United States and NATO to stop, saying, quote, you promised not 1 inch of eastward expansion. So far, you've expanded eastward 1,000 miles into 10 countries. He called us on it. And he gave a little history lesson. It's one of the things, if you ever listen to Putin talk, and I mean, really get a chance to talk. He did about an hour and a half, 2-hour podcast or sit down interview with Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson put it on his podcast. And about half of the podcast of the interview, so you talk about an hour of it, was just Putin educating people on history. The guy, as a history teacher myself, I am very impressed with the amount of history that man knows. I think he could. I don't think there's been a U.S. president that I'm aware of that could stand on equal footing and talk history with this man. He knows the history. And so at this Munich conference, he reminds the West that Russia has been invaded 3 times through Ukraine. In other words, he's saying, listen, this isn't just some random country that we've decided to draw a red line through. This isn't whimsical or just, I woke up this morning and said, it's Ukraine. Ukraine's the red line. Now, we've been invaded 3 times in our history through Ukraine. In 1236, it was Genghis Khan, which resulted in over 2.5 centuries of Mongol rule in Russia, and they came through Ukraine. Fast forward to 1812, it was Napoleon, and fast forward to 1941, it was Adolf Hitler. You don't get much bigger than Genghis Khan, Napoleon Bonaparte, and Adolf Hitler when it comes to aggressive behavior. And all 3 of them, in an effort to conquer the largest geographical landmass country in the world, went through Ukraine to get to Russia. And so he says, this is our red line because we have been attacked through Ukraine 3 times. One of the times we lost. And the result was Mongol rule for 2.5 centuries. Now, we didn't lose Napoleon, we didn't lose Hitler, but that doesn't mean we didn't suffer. It was a terrible, terrible time in Russia, all 3 times. And he says, that's the red line. We're not going to go through that again. That's in 2007. So he warns the world. And what was our response to that? The response was in 2008, a year later, and not really a full year later, just April 2000, the spring of 2008, in Bucharest, Romania, at the NATO summit, the United States, which remember now, the United States basically is NATO, proposed to add Ukraine and Georgia to NATO. So this is George H.W. Bush, and he's saying, hey, I know what Putin said. It doesn't matter. We're going to expand NATO into Ukraine and Georgia anyway. And this is right on the heels of being warned by Putin that this is a red line. Now, other world leaders, just like previous, when I said U.S. world leaders warned Clinton this is a mistake, George Kennan, William Perry. Well, now, world leaders, Nicolas Sarkozy of France and Angela Merkel of Germany, both told George W. Bush, this is a mistake. Merkel said Putin would view it as a declaration of war. And they were not happy with this. They said that, we just heard Putin say that this is a red line. And, you can understand why France and Germany would be alarmed by this, because probably what would happen if a war broke out between the United States and between NATO and Russia, Putin would attack the closest NATO countries. And that's not us. That's these countries in Europe. So that would be France and Germany. And so the leaders of France and Germany are like, whoa, wait a second. Let's think about this. Bill Burns, the U.S. ambassador to Moscow, wrote a memo to the U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice stating that the proposal to add Ukraine to NATO was, quote, the brightest of red lines, and it would lead to unending trouble. So again, we have this argument between realists and neocons, and the realists are telling the neocons, we know what you want. You want world domination. You want this to be a unipolar world where the United States is in charge of everybody and everything. And you're using NATO to accomplish this world domination. I'm telling you, and these people are saying, I'm telling you, there's a red line here, and you are about to step in it or step over it, and it's going to lead to unending trouble or war. Again, the United States ignores the warnings. George W. Bush doubles down and proposes to add Georgia and Ukraine to NATO anyway. So here you see these 2 countries, and of course, an argument could be made over these countries that have experienced previous NATO expansion. Some of them were not directly on the Russian border, so who cares? I tell you who cares. The Russians care. These are their border states that they consider to be their buffer zone against any kind of attack coming from the West. And now they've all been swallowed up. You look at all the blue countries there that have joined the dark blue countries. Those are all NATO now. The Russians are literally surrounded by NATO countries, and now the two countries left, Ukraine and Georgia down the south there, are being proposed for membership in NATO as well. And, you know, you can almost see Putin thinking, you almost understand the calculation that Putin is making. You know, okay, they lied to Mikhail Gorbachev and they expanded all these different times. And so I went and I warned them, and they just ignored me. They have treated Mikhail Gorbachev with so little respect. And then his successor was Boris Yeltsin. And now it's me. They literally don't care what we say. They literally don't care what promises they make. They literally have no regard for us at all. And even when we say stop, they ignore us. And so that brings us to 2008. This is right on the heels of George W. Bush proposing Georgia first for membership, Ukraine second. Leads to a real quick war called the August War in where? Georgia. Just like Burns predicted, just like Sarkozy and Merkel predicted, just like uh, uh, William Perry predicted, George Kennan predicted. If you keep expanding eastward with NATO, you're lucky you haven't run into problems to this point. But if you keep expanding, at some point, you're going to push the Russians too far. And Putin told everybody at the Munich conference just where that red line was, and W. Bush went in anyway. So the Russians baited a trap, and the Georgian leader, Mikhail Saakashvili, walked right into it. Okay, this was a pretext, basically. Vladimir Putin just couldn't invade, and so he laid a trap, and the Georgian leader initiated hostilities against Russian-speaking people in South Ossetia, which is part of Georgia, and it provided Putin with a pretext he needed to come in and crush the Georgian military. Does it sound familiar? It's exactly what happens in Ukraine later. There's Russian-speaking people in different provinces of these countries, and they're native Russians. Their loyalties are with Russia, and the Georgian leader, just like later the Ukrainian leader, don't like these people, and they're always, causing trouble with these people, and that gives Putin an excuse to go in and protect these Russian-speaking people that are appealing for him to come to their aid. And it leads to this 5-day war. The Russian goal here is to prevent NATO expansion in Georgia, right? Clearly, if Russia wanted to go into, I've got it circled up here on the map, you can see South Ossetia and where the conflict is taking place. It's contained within the borders of South Ossetia there. If Putin's objective was to swallow up Georgia, that wouldn't have been a problem. Okay, he could have continued on into and taken all of Georgia if he'd wanted to. He didn't. He went into the Russian-speaking part because he's trying to make a point, and it worked. Temporarily, NATO paused its expansions efforts along Russia's border, and so the message that sends to Putin is, okay, we don't want them to expand. They obviously don't listen to my words, so I have to use my military. And if I use my military and show that I'm willing to use my military, they'll stop. And so that's the lesson that came out of this 5-day war in Georgia. And but that doesn't mean that the idea, this very bad idea of NATO expansion, has disappeared. In 2010, Ukraine has an election, and they elect Viktor Yanukovych. Now, Yanukovych is a supporter of Ukrainian neutrality, which means he's not a supporter of NATO membership. He's not pro-Russia. He's not pro-West. He's just neutral. He says, I don't want to be the cause of any problem between the East and the West. I don't want to be a NATO member because that will cause problems, clearly. And he gets elected. And this is not what the United States wanted. They wanted a pro-Western a pro-NATO membership president. And so in 2014, led by Victoria Nuland, who was the U.S. Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, pictured here at the bottom, she comes right from the Brzezinski family tree of neocons. So the neocons are in charge. This is 2014. This is Barack Obama. Okay, so this is his. So you see the progression here. Started this promise H.W. Bush made, and then the project Clinton started the 30-year project, which was the breaking of that promise, and George W. Bush followed up on that, probably did more so than anybody, and now it's Barack Obama's turn. And all these presidents come along, and they've been informed of what the project is, and they're all going along with it. And it doesn't even matter what they campaigned on. That doesn't matter. The reality is they are informed once they take office of what their responsibilities to this project are, and they jump on board. They fall in line. Victoria Nuland was recorded in 2014 in January, choosing the Ukrainian cabinet. She said, these are the people we're going to pick, and they're going to be put in place after the coup that is being planned by the United States to overthrow Yanukovych. We need to get rid of Yanukovych because as long as Yanukovych is in charge, we can't expand NATO into Ukraine. And of course, this is all a pretext to provoke Putin and provoke Russia. We can't meddle in the affairs of Ukraine like we want as long as Yanukovych is in charge. And so in January of 2014, Victoria Nuland is on recording 1 month before a coup that takes place. This is a U.S. backed by the CIA front U.S. aid, which spent $5 billion in a violent overthrow, they call it the Ukrainian Revolution, of Yanukovych, and they replace him with our puppet, Petro Poroshenko. So here we have, the U.S. aid has been in the news, and it's been interesting when Elon Musk and Doge started exposing all this money that was being basically laundered through U.S. aid to meddle in the affairs of these other third world countries and other European countries. People got on TV, defenders of U.S. aid, and said, well, if you cut off all this aid, this foreign aid to these countries, they're gonna squawk. They're gonna complain. They need that aid. They depend on that aid. And it's been interesting. But all these countries that were getting aid from U.S. aid, which is a CIA front, everybody knows that, none of them have complained. You haven't heard anybody in the news from these countries saying, give us back our money, give us back our aid from USA, because they don't like USA. U.S. aid meddles in the affairs of their country, meddles in the affairs of their government, basically runs their country. And so you haven't had, the only people complaining about U.S. aid are the people back home, the politicians that got rich off of it, the neocons that used it as their cudgel instrument to create all these never-ending wars, to overthrow these governments, to expand U.S. influence and create this hegemony, U.S. hegemony that basically dominates the world, this unipolar world, creating this unipolar world through these CIA fronts like U.S. aid. $5 billion documented money that we spent to overthrow, to launch this coup, this democratically elected government in Ukraine in 2014, because it wasn't a convenient government. It wasn't pro-NATO expansion. It wasn't pro-West. It was neutral. They weren't even taking the side of the Russians. They're just neutral. They want to stay in the middle, not cause problems. We overthrew them. Our government overthrew their democratically elected government and installed a puppet. And of course, what's the first thing this puppet does? They immediately launch a war against the ethnic Russian population on Donbass, which is the part of Ukraine that is Russian speaking. They banned the Russian language. They banned ethnic Russians from getting citizenship. They killed 14,000 ethnic Russians in this Donbass war. And you can see here in this map that's Ukraine. And if you look at the area, Russian as native language, that dark red, it's down in Crimea and in that other area called Donbass there. 75% of the population there speaks Russian. These are Russian people. They're loyal to Russia, but they're part of Ukraine. And then even in the bright red, between 25 and 74% speak Russian there. So a lot. And then even in the darker yellow, you have between 5 and 24%. And so, but it's primarily these red areas that are the Russian speaking people. And it's the same playbook again, just like in Georgia. The Georgian leader went in and started killing and making trouble for the Russian speaking people there in Georgia, and it forced Putin to come in. Here they're doing the same thing in Ukraine. Now, this was not happening when Yanushchenko was in charge. Did I get his name right? I want to go back and make sure I get his name right. Yanukovych. When Yanukovych was in charge, none of this was happening. But now Poroshenko is in charge. He's the U.S. puppet. And the very first thing after he's installed by us as a result of the coup is he starts going, this shows you what we're trying to do. We're trying to cause Putin to do the same thing in Ukraine he did in Georgia. Because we want a proxy war with Putin. We want a proxy war with the Soviets, or with the Russians. And so what happens next? This is 2014. Russia annexes that area. I showed you Crimea, which is where about 75% of people speak Russian. These are ethnic Russians. They wanted Putin. They invited him in. They said, come in, annex Crimea, take Crimea, make it part of Russia, and protect us from this new leader, this U.S. puppet here, Poroshenko. Crimea was important for a couple reasons. It if you can see my cursor, it's up here. I'm circling it here, the Crimea. You can see it juts out into the Black Sea, and the Black Sea, if you follow this route here, outlets into the Mediterranean Sea. And so Putin was concerned that this area of Russian-speaking people, Crimea, if it ever fell into the hands of Ukraine and they denied Russia access, they could potentially deny Russia access to the Black Sea, and by using they could, if they become a NATO ally of the United States, they could put a base, they could put missiles right there on the Crimean Peninsula, and all of a sudden the Russians would lose access, water access to the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. So Putin annexes Crimea without firing a shot, didn't have to kill anybody. He was invited in by the Crimean people. Donbass, the other Russian-speaking, quickly voted 90% in favor of also joining Russia, but Putin didn't have any use for Donbass. Now I'm going to go back, show you the map again so you can see why. Donbass is not as strategically as important to Putin as the Crimean Peninsula. The Crimean Peninsula is the area that controls access to the Black Sea. Donbass is not. It has a little bit of frontage there to the Black Sea, but in theory, you could control Donbass and still lose access to the Black Sea because Crimea is standing in the way. If you control Crimea, you control the Black Sea. And so he's not interested in gaining territory necessarily. He's interested in retaining access to the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. So when Donbass votes 90% to join Russia, he says, no, you stay with Ukraine. And his quote was, I want Ukraine to be a, quote, functioning state. So I think this proves, again, everybody, I've heard over and over again that Putin is to blame for the Ukraine war because he's trying to reconstitute the old Soviet empire. And he's trying to gobble up all this territory and create the Soviet Union again, all over again. Well, if that were true, then when he invaded that little portion of Georgia, he would have taken all of Georgia, but he didn't. If that were true, that when he goes in, he's invited in to the Crimean Peninsula, that he would have taken Donbass when they voted 90% to join, and possibly all of Ukraine, but he didn't. Right? He's more interested in maintaining the status quo. In the Georgia situation, he wanted to stop NATO expansion, and they did pause. That was the net effect of it. In the Ukraine situation in 2014, after the neutral government was overthrown by the U.S. in a coup, replaced by a pro-Western, pro-NATO expansion U.S. puppet, and he started making trouble for all the Russian-speaking people, killing 14,000 of them. He went in and took Crimea to maintain access to the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. But when Donbass tried to join, he said no. So he wasn't trying to gain territory. I don't see any evidence of him trying to reconstitute the old Soviet empire. All right, so now, we've got this situation going on between Russia and Ukraine, primarily in the Crimea Peninsula. And so the next event was the Minsk Accords. This is a 12-point multinational ceasefire proposal to settle the issue between Russia and Ukraine. Here's a picture of the negotiators: Germany, France, England, Russia. They all signed on to end the Donbass War. Remember, the Donbass War is a direct result of our meddling in their election, overthrowing Yanukovych, putting in Poroshenko, who immediately goes into Donbass, starts killing Russians, Russian-speaking people, took away their rights to citizenship, et cetera, et cetera. So the net effect of that was Putin goes in. So we got this war between Russia and Ukraine in the Donbass War. All the parties signed on except for one, Ukraine. They're waiting for Ukraine to sign to end this war. Meanwhile, we have an election in 2019 whereby Vladimir Zelensky, and that's a name that should be familiar to everybody, is elected. This guy won 70% of the vote in the election because he campaigned literally on one promise. Kind of reminds me of Donald Trump when he ran on basically one promise, which was build a wall. I mean, that was the first thing that came to people's mind. Vladimir Zelensky ran with one promise. He ran on a peace platform, promising that as soon as he's elected, he's going to sign the Minsk Accords and end the war between Ukraine and Russia over Donbass and Crimea. So that's why he won 70%. That's clearly indicative of the will of the people wanting to have peace with the Russians. However, just like U.S. presidents were informed once they became president, Zelensky, upon taking office, was informed by his U.S. puppeteers, Victoria Nuland pictured here, she's one of them, that he was not allowed to sign the Minsk Accords. So he's not, Ukraine is no longer a sovereign nation. Ukraine, as a result of the coup in 2014, is now under the direct control, it doesn't matter who the president is, but under the direct control of the United States. And Victoria Nuland is here giving him the facts of life. And she's saying, I know what you ran on. That got you elected. But here's the reality of the situation. You are not going to sign the Minsk Accords. So he breaks his promise to the Ukrainian people and refuses to sign the Minsk Accords. How many times have I heard people say, there is no such thing as a deep state? There's no such thing as a national security apparatus that controls the elected leaders of these countries. And of course, a lot of time, most time they're referring to the United States. Well, if that's the case, why are 30 years worth of U.S. presidents all falling in line once they're informed by their neocon bosses of their role to participate in this NATO expansion process? They all, and here we see evidence where not only U.S. presidents falling in line once they're informed by somebody who exercises more power than they even have. But here you see Zelensky doing the same thing in Ukraine. There is a deep state, and they're unelected, they're unaccountable, and presidents come and go, foreign leaders come and go, but their agenda continues. And they exercise so much power that when a U.S. president tries to buck up against it, he runs into this resistance. And if he doesn't fall in line, something bad happens to him. For example, Kennedy didn't fall in line, something bad happened to him. Nixon didn't fall in line, something bad happened to him. Trump after this 30-year project sort of begins under Clinton, does not fall in line. And it's been nothing but bad things have happened to Trump from these same deep staters. Every other president fell in line. You look at all the wars that have had, these never-ending wars, these neocons, whether they're Republican or Democrat, it doesn't even matter. Irregardless of party, that doesn't even matter. These deep staters don't care what party you're from. These neocons, they have this agenda to expand NATO and use that as a blunt instrument to impose U.S. power in this new unipolar world whereby U.S. hegemony, I have a hard time saying that word, is on display all around the world. It's all about world domination. And it doesn't matter who the leaders are, they fall in line. And if they don't, something bad happens to them. So he breaks his promise. He doesn't sign the Minsk Accords. And so the net effect of that is, as I just said, the United States is now running Ukraine. And Putin is thinking about this, and he's realizing, okay, it's clear who the masters are in the Ukraine, which means I'm not dealing with Ukraine. I'm not dealing with any of these European nations. I'm dealing with the United States. What if the U.S. Navy occupies Vladivostok, which is Russia's 347-year-old southern warm water port? It's the only one we get. It's the only one they got. And I've put a red box on this map on the top. You can see where Vladivostok is. It's you say, well, that's a long ways from Ukraine. Well, it's part of Ukraine. 100 years ago, a Ukrainian flag flew over Vladivostok and other parts of the Russian Far East. And what he's afraid of is that the United States Navy, since it's the United States is basically running Ukraine, will put a fleet, a naval fleet, in Vladivostok, preventing the Russians from having access to any warm water. I mean, you see how important access to water is when we talked about the Donbass war. He went right into Crimea because the Crimean Peninsula controlled the Black Sea, which gave access to the Mediterranean Sea. Now he's worried about Ukraine being controlled by U.S. And if the U.S. Navy comes in, takes over Vladivostok or ports there, it's going to prevent the Russians from having any access at all to a warm water port. That's a problem. Second, knowing that the U.S. has already backed out of these two ABM treaties, he's afraid that they're going to start putting these Aegis missiles in Ukraine. They've already done it in Poland. They've already done it in Romania. What would prevent them from doing it in Ukraine? And now they will have American offensive missiles aimed at Russian targets right on their border. This is why I call this whole Ukraine war sort of a reconstitution of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Just as we went to the brink of nuclear war with the Soviets in 1962 over their putting missiles in Cuba aimed at our cities, in Ukraine in 2020, in the 2020s, is protesting the fact that we're able now to put missiles. If Ukraine becomes a NATO member, that means the Americans, having already done it in other NATO countries that they've expanded eastward into, can now put these same American missiles aimed at Russian targets on their border. And of course, if you're the leader of Russia, just like the leader of America could not let that stand in Cuba, the leader of Russia cannot let that stand in Ukraine. It's just common sense, right? And so February 2022, we have the launching of the Russia-Ukraine war. But you've just heard the backstory to understand that this has been a long time coming. This has been a series of provocations, whereby first the Americans made a promise, no NATO expansion east. We broke that promise, and we began expanding eastward time and time again. We violated or broke the ABM treaties, which means now we can start putting missiles, offensive missiles, on Russia's border. And when Putin said the red line is Ukraine and Georgia, we went into Ukraine and Georgia anyway. And so he goes into Georgia to make a point and try to stop NATO expansion. It works temporarily. And then when the Americans overthrow the neutral government of Ukraine and install a pro-West, pro-NATO expansion government, and they start killing Russian citizens in Ukraine, he goes into Ukraine to try to stop that at Donbass, creates a Donbass war, and then to settle that, they have the Minsk Accords, which everybody signs on to except who? The Ukrainians. Why? Because the U.S. told them no. The U.S. doesn't want peace in Ukraine. The U.S. wants to use Ukraine as a proxy to fight Russia. And of course, we're going to find out straight from the horse's mouth what the whole point of this is. It's all about regime change. They want Putin out, and they want to affect regime change through a proxy war in Ukraine. This is why they keep meddling in the affairs of the Ukrainians. We're going to have a coup, get rid of your leader. We're going to put in this other guy. He's going to cause problems. It's going to cause Putin to respond. We're going to, we're going to tell Zelensky after he runs and promises peace, we're going to tell him he can't make peace, no Minsk Accords, and it's going to lead to this war. So sure enough, February 2022, Putin invades Ukraine. And he's trying to force Ukraine and the U.S. back to the negotiating table. He's figuring, okay, this is what you do. It's like right now, there is, the Trump administration is trying to negotiate a ceasefire, which will lead to a permanent peace. And Putin is smart. He's winning the war right now as we speak in Ukraine. So whenever he doesn't get the terms that he wants, he just launches another attack in Ukraine, causes more damage, kills more people, just to demonstrate yet one more time that he is operating from a position of strength and that the Ukrainians are operating from a position of weakness. And of course, by extension, the United States as well, because that side is losing. His side is winning. That's what you do to get a better deal. You apply pressure. And so Putin invades Ukraine with 40,000 troops. Now, this is important. This is symbolically important. Ukraine is a nation of 44 million people. How many times have you heard in the news that Putin is trying to take over Ukraine? If that were the case, he would have invaded Ukraine with a lot more troops than 40,000. For example, when the Germans invaded the western half of Poland, remember, they weren't trying to take all of Poland. They'd made a deal with the Russians. We'll take the western half, you take the eastern half. So they invaded the western half of Poland. They came with 1.5 million troops to do that in 1939. To conquer and occupy Ukraine, which is much larger than half of Poland, it would require at least 3 million troops. Putin never intended, when he invaded Ukraine, to take over Ukraine. He came with a small force. This is a pinprick size force trying to drive. It had worked before in Georgia when he went into the small region of Georgia, South Ossetia. He went in with a small force to protect the Russian-speaking people in South Ossetia, but primarily to send a message to the West: you cannot expand NATO into Georgia. And temporarily it worked. And so he's following the same playbook. He's going into Ukraine with a small force to drive the United States and the Ukrainians back to the peace table to try to get that Minsk Accord signed. The only people that won't sign on are the Ukrainians, and that's because the U.S. won't let them. So he's trying to drive them back to the negotiating table. I think that's the clearest evidence that what we've been told is such a lie, that Putin is intent on European domination. He's trying to reconstitute the old Soviet empire. If he were, he would be using much larger forces. He would have swallowed up all of Georgia. He would have come into Ukraine with an overwhelming force, but he hadn't done either one of those things. And in both cases, he was willing to make peace. It was the Ukrainians who wouldn't. It was the United States that wouldn't. Isn't that interesting? Now, Zelensky, who's operating as the U.S. puppet, knows that the U.S. will not support any peace efforts. So in February 2020, he goes to Israel and Turkey asking for diplomatic help to try to work out a peace agreement between him and Putin. And as a result of that, we get the Istanbul communique. Istanbul, obviously, is a city in Turkey. And this would have ended the war with the provision that Ukraine not join NATO, which is exactly what Putin wants. And both sides were prepared to sign. Russia even began withdrawing troops. This is in April of 2022. And right about that point in time, Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, shows up, acting on behalf of a new U.S. President, Joe Biden, traveled to Ukraine and ordered Zelensky to not negotiate with Russia. This is the second time Zelensky's been informed or given the facts of life by the United States. The first time was when Victoria Nuland told him after he won the election, you cannot sign the Minsk Accords. I know you ran on a peace platform, but you cannot sign them. And of course, he knew who the boss was, so he didn't. Now he's being told in April 2022 that the U.S. president, through his messenger boy, Boris Johnson, is telling him not to negotiate with Russia so the war will continue. And so December of 2024, I just wanted to show you this. This is something that is happening currently as we speak. December 2024 is not that long ago. Romania, which shares the Ukrainian border on the west, had an election of their own. And the guy who was winning the election after the first round was a pro-Russia, anti-NATO expansion candidate. His name is Kalin Gorgescu. You can see here pictures of him at the top and at the bottom here. And because he was winning the election after the first round, it was pretty apparent he was going to win. The Romanian people wanted somebody in there who was against NATO expansion into Ukraine. He was viewed as a pro-Russian guy. The EU and NATO, i.e. the United States, pressured Romania's constitutional court into nullifying the presidential election, and they alleged Russian interference in the election. Does it sound familiar? It's the same thing that they've alleged both times Trump has won here in the United States. Both times. They said, well, he's Vladimir Putin's guy. There's been Russian interference in the election. And that's an excuse to basically stop democracy, the democratic process from happening, stop the election. And they didn't stop there. They actually arrested this guy. Here's a picture of him being taken away. They arrested him. They charged him with genocide. This is the guy who was winning Romania's election. What was his only crime? His only crime is that he was anti-NATO expansion. In other words, and of course, Romania is right on Ukraine's border. And so the United States, and it's a NATO country. And so the United States came in and does what it does. It bullied the Romanian process, bullied the Romanians in the court, and they charged him with genocide. His only crime is that he's not supportive of NATO expansion into Ukraine. He's not supportive of this infinity war that NATO and the United States are embarking upon. He was released under judicial control and put on a gag order, the same kind of gag order that Trump was put on all the times that the lawfare was going on and during the time he was running for president back in 2023 and 24. Remember, all those judges threw gag orders on him, which means he could not appear. He couldn't say anything. He couldn't appear on mass media and say certain things. He couldn't create social media accounts and say certain things. He was under gag order. Trump here, and now currently, as we speak, Gorgescu is also under gag order in Romania. And of course, Romanians don't have any evidence on him of the crimes that they're alleging, so they just refuse to release any findings or any proof of the allegations. And they're just operating basically under the thumb of the EU and NATO, which means the United States. And I bring up the Romanian example because it shows that the United States is like a puppeteer pulling the strings of all these countries over there. And right now, the big issue is Ukraine, and Romania is important because it's right on Ukraine's border. And if a pro-Russian leader is elected as Romania's president, that's another country, and there's a couple already who are starting to resist NATO expansion. They're starting to resist the talk. They don't want this Ukraine-Russia war to continue. You can't have Ukraine surrounded by these people that agree with Putin, and so you meddle in their affairs, you dictate the terms, you overthrow leaders that don't agree with you, and you install puppets that do agree with you so you can get your way. What is it that the United States wants? What is it that we're after? We're after a proxy war with the Soviets. And in episodes 2 and 3, I'll give you evidence of that. But these are some of the false assumptions that we've been taught or told. It's been communicated to us through the media over and over and over again since 2022 when Putin invaded Ukraine. And if all you know is the history of Russia and Ukraine from 2022 forward, you have a very incomplete understanding of why 2022 happened. You have a very limited view of history, and you don't understand cause and effect. What I've just tried to explain to you in this little backstory, this little story of the backstory, is how the United States put the world on a path towards this Ukraine-Russia war. We broke our promises time and time again by expanding NATO eastward. We nullified the ABM treaties, which gave us clearance to put offensive nuclear missiles, Aegis missiles, in all these new NATO countries aimed at Russian targets right on the Russian border. And when we proposed expanding NATO again into Ukraine and Georgia, and Putin warned us that's a red line, don't do it, we went anyway. And when Putin went into Georgia to stop NATO expansion, it worked temporarily. And then we start meddling in the elections down in Ukraine. We overthrow the neutral guy. We replace him with our puppet, and we immediately go in and start killing Russian-speaking people in Ukraine. And that causes a war in Donbass. And when the peace treaty is negotiated, all the countries sign on to it, including Russia. And Putin starts pulling the troops out of Ukraine. The U.S. tells the new leader of Ukraine, Zelensky, you cannot negotiate. You can't negotiate with the Russians. And twice we forbid, once through Victoria Nuland, the second time through Boris Johnson, we forbid Zelensky from signing on to any kind of peace treaty with the. There's been 2 attempts at a peace treaty already. One was the Minsk, and the second was the Istanbul communique. And in both cases, it was the United States that forbade the Ukraine leader from signing those peace treaties. And that's why there will be a peace agreement this time, because the U.S. is pulling the strings, and we have a different president now, and Trump wants peace. And when he's the wild card, he's the president that's not going along with NATO expansion. He's already said flat out, Ukraine NATO expansion is off the table in Ukraine. It's probably what started the war to begin with. It's definitely what started the war. So Ukraine is not a functioning sovereign state. It is doing whatever the United States tells it to do. And it's one of the reasons why, Ukraine was so invested in a Democrat winning the election in 2024. He campaigned in Pennsylvania with the Pennsylvania governor, Josh Shapiro, and Kamala Harris. He came because he wanted a continuation of the policy, which was unlimited support for the United States to continue the war. And of course, his masters here at the United States said, hey, for this to continue, you've got to help us win. And when they didn't win, Trump won, everything got turned upside down on its head. But that's the backstory to why we are where we are. This false assumption that Russia invaded Ukraine unprovoked. Unprovoked. They use that word. Biden must have said it 100 times in speeches. I heard it. Unprovoked, unprovoked. We provoked him every step along the way. We provoked him when we broke our promises and expanded NATO. We provoked him when we pulled out of the ABM treaties. We provoked him when we invited Ukraine and Georgia in. We we provoked him when we ignored Putin's warning. We provoked him when we said we were going to put missiles in Ukraine and Georgia right on Russia's border. We provoked, we provoked, we provoked. And then when peace treaty in Minsk, and we told him not to sign, we provoked him. And then the Istanbul communique, when everybody signed except Ukraine, and we told them not to sign. We provoked them. I mean, my God, we've been provoking. The provocations have been unending from the West. And when I say the West, I mean the United States. The Russia-Ukraine war is not a proxy war. That's another false assumption. That's all it is. If you look back historically, we've not fought the Russians. We don't want to fight the Russians head to head. And so we find these proxies. And we did it in Korea, we did it in Vietnam, we did it in Afghanistan, Cuba. Now we're doing it in Ukraine. And we've done it in Syria. We're looking at, now they're talking, the next one is Iran. These are proxy wars with the Soviets. You notice all those countries are countries that have, they have, I don't say an alliance, but they have, they're part of the Russian sphere, so to speak. North Korea, North Vietnam. These were areas where the Soviets were trying to expand. So you can almost make an argument we're trying to contain their expansion. Afghanistan, Ukraine. These are wars in their part of the world with countries that are allied with Russia, and we don't want to fight Russia directly, so we fight him through a proxy. Ukraine is a proxy war with the Russians. Putin is principally responsible for the Russia-Ukraine war. I just showed anybody with any kind of balance to their view, if they have a balanced view of what is occurring, you'd say Putin has a part to play, but he's not principally responsible for the Russia-Ukraine war. We bear more responsibility for the Russia-Ukraine war than Putin does. He's been very clear all on the way. He's not broken his promises. It's us. He didn't pull out the ABM treaties. It was us. He didn't try to expand in our hemisphere on our border. We did all that. He's not principally responsible. He's playing defense. We're the ones on offense all the way up in this entire scenario. Another false assumption is that Putin is the second coming of Hitler and he invaded Ukraine to conquer it. Oh, really? With 40,000 troops? That was his attempt to conquer it? He's doing a pretty bad job if that's what his goal is. Another false assumption is that Putin invaded Ukraine to begin reconstituting the old Soviet Empire. Again, if that were true, why didn't he take all of Georgia? Why didn't he come in with an overwhelming force to take all of Ukraine? Why hasn't he moved into other Baltic states? Why did he allow all these formerly Baltic states to become NATO members and not do anything until drawing a red line at Ukraine and Georgia? Again, it doesn't line up. Another false assumption is that Russia-Ukraine war is less about Russian security than it is about Russian territory. This idea that he's trying to accumulate all this new territory. Really? Or is it just about Russian security? When he talked at the Munich conference, he said, listen, you can't go through Ukraine. You can't add Ukraine to NATO because we have been invaded 3 times through Ukraine. That's all about security. And again, every time he goes into these, Georgia, he went into South Ossetia, not all of Georgia. So they got plenty of territory. Russia's the largest country in the world geographically. They don't need any more territory, but they're very hypersensitive about their security. That's probably the fundamental difference between Russians and Americans. Americans are concerned with democracy and freedom of speech and all those kinds of things. And security is not primarily our concern because we've never been attacked. The Russians have been attacked. And democracy and freedom of speech, those are all luxury items. the thing that they're most concerned about, hyper paranoid about, is their security. So we're coming at things from two different angles here. We're concerned more about freedom of speech, human rights, democracy, and all these warm fuzzies. The Russians, that would be nice, but primarily what they're concerned about is their security. And that's what guides everything in Russia. Does this make us more secure or less secure? And when he warned the West, this is what diplomats are supposed to understand. When he warned the West, said, don't come in and expand NATO into Ukraine or Georgia, we should have understood. You know, some people did. Angela Merkel did. Sarkozy did. William Burns did. George Kennan did. William Perry did. Some people did. But the neocons who were running everything said, screw it, we're going anyway. And then lastly, President Monroe's doctrine, which applied to the Western Hemisphere, this false assumption is that it is a false equivalent to Putin's red line in Ukraine. Okay, if you study history, you know that James Monroe issued a doctrine telling Europe to stay out of our affairs, and we would stay out of theirs. And he said the Western Hemisphere is ours. Don't meddle in our affairs. We won't meddle in your affairs. And that's pretty much how we operated as a country for a long time. And it was understood. You know, if it's in our hemisphere, we have a right to care about who's doing what there. Well, why is it any different for Putin to care about countries that are on his border? And when he draws a red line, says Ukraine is a non-starter, there's no negotiation. You're not expanding NATO into Ukraine or Georgia. You're not putting missiles there. Why is that so hard to understand for us? And yet we completely understand the Monroe Doctrine, which is why Kennedy, we felt he was justified doing whatever was necessary to get the Soviet missiles out of Cuba. Why is that right for us but not right for Putin? You can't have it both ways. Why is it that we're justified in preventing the Soviets or the Russians from meddling in the Western Hemisphere, but the Russians are not justified from preventing us from meddling in their hemisphere on their border? Why is it good for us but not good for them? Is not their security just as important to them as our security is to us? That's why I titled this episode Ukraine, Putin's Cuban Missile Crisis. That we had a Cuban Missile Crisis and we stood up and said, sorry, that's not going to happen. That's not going to stand. And if it comes to nuclear war, so be it. Putin has his own Cuban Missile Crisis now with Ukraine right on his border, proposed for NATO membership, which would open the door for missiles to be put on his border. And he's saying, sorry, that's a red line. If it leads to a nuclear war, so be it. I hope it doesn't. But you're not putting missiles in there aimed at us. I would be negligent as a leader, borderline criminal, treasonous as a leader to allow that to happen. Just like any American president would be as well. It'd be like us telling the Russians, you can put missiles in Canada. It'd be like us allowing the Russians to put missiles in Canada and Mexico and aim them at all our cities in between. We wouldn't do that. So why is Putin supposed to do that? I don't get it. I don't get it. So anyway, that's the backstory to this Ukraine-Russia war. And in the next episode, we're going to expand on that a little bit and show why Putin himself personally has become such a lightning rod to the American side. I mean, you want to smear somebody today, just say they're a Putin. They agree with Putin, or they're repeating Putin talking points. Just link any American politician with Putin. And he's like the modern day version of Hitler. And methinks that this is the result of a lot of propaganda, that this is the result of a lot of disinformation, misinformation that is intentional to create a boogeyman, because we have an agenda, and the guy standing in the way of that agenda is Putin. And so if that means we've got to create this impression in the American people and the consciousness and the psyche of the American people that everything Putin does is bad, and everything we do is good. And that'll just, but that kind of manipulation is dangerous. It is so dangerous. So I wanted to begin this mini-series with a backstory, how we got to this point, how NATO expansion was basically the U.S. breaking promise after promise after promise, and then us getting out of the ABM treaties, plural, gave us, once we started expanding NATO in all these Eastern European countries on Russia's border, getting out of the ABM treaties was the next step, which gave us the clearance to put missiles in those countries aimed at Russian targets. And that's when the Russians sat up, took notice, and said, okay, we got to draw a line here somewhere. For a long time, they didn't. They were, and we'll talk about why they didn't. We'll talk about Yeltsin and why he didn't. Well, finally, when we get to Putin, Putin does. We didn't have a problem with Yeltsin because Yeltsin let us do whatever we wanted. All of a sudden, we had a problem with Putin because Putin drew a line and says, okay, enough's enough. I'm not going to do that anymore. And so we'll get into that in the second episode in this series. Until then, I hope everybody has a blessed day. Thank you.